Hello, and welcome back to the HearTOGETHER podcast from the Philadelphia Orchestra. I'm your host, Tori Marchiony, and this is a space to hear from the artists and activists working to create a more equitable future, inside and outside the concert hall. You just heard a bit of the Attacca Quartet performing Imago by our guest today, Inti figgis-vizueta. Inti's practice explores entirely new structures of musical notation and includes philosophical writing on subjects like how the label of experimental artist actually forces composers to continue defining their work in relation to the status quo. And the status quo has never worked for Inti. After a series of what she has called disappointing and harmful experiences within academic and professional institutions, Inti opted out and built a career on her own terms. Freelance composing has brought commissions from Roomful of Teeth, Kronos Quartet, and LA Philharmonic, to name just a few. In 2020, she received the ASCAP Foundation Fred Ho Award, and this year, she won a music fellowship from the Civatella Ranieri Foundation, an American artists community located at a 15th century castle in the Umbria region of Italy. Not too shabby. But it did take some time and a lot of effort for Inti to finally find her feet and her voice.
For some time, I thought that every time someone looked at me or looked at my score, they were kind of judging how smart I was. And so I would be like, oh, I'm so smart. I want to make sure that this is an unbreakable equation. And then it's actually, the moment you keep piling on more, it becomes so indecipherable with all its detail that it just weighs down and kind of can't move.
Today, Inti is well known for her inventive notations, designed to create space. Space where performers are given the agency to bring their own interpretations. Space where the rigid roles of composer, performer, and listener are disrupted. Space where imagination offers genuine liberation from oppressive hierarchies. But she doesn't stop there. Another liberatory practice that Inti has made routine is the case of writing her name. I'm curious what the reason is behind the lowercase spelling of your name.
I think probably the first place that a lot of us kind of encounter that is bell hooks and, kind of so much of this, particularly Black feminism. But I think just around in my case, just the idea of kind of creating an artistic space for myself a little bit. Coming to this country and kind of going into so many different institutions young, my name got kind of messed up so much and things were out of order or things were misspelled. Things are still misspelled all the time. But I think part of it is just trying to have there be some care when you touch it and when you include it in spaces.
Got it. Thank you. Now, in your artist bio, you talk about the influence of your upbringing on your music in a way that makes me very curious to know more. So, it reads, NYC-based composer Inti figgis-vizueta writes magically real music through the lens of personal identities, braiding a childhood of overlapping immigrant communities and Black-founded freedom schools in Chocolate City, D.C., with direct Andean and Irish heritage and a deep connection to the land. So yeah, that touches on a lot, but I'm just really interested to know what your experiences day to day living in those overlapping communities was really like.
Totally. It was a big kind of village I had growing up. My mom moved to the city as a single mom, just with me, and kind of didn't have a lot of money and was kind of working in community organizing contexts from the moment that she arrived. Through that, you get a lot of community. Sometimes we're walking down the street or we look at a house and it's oh, do you remember this person? They took care of you for 3 days. When you were 6, I had to be out of town for this thing and they were so kind. So I think it was a lot of kind of those feelings with particularly the neighborhoods that I grew up in, which was Mount Pleasant in DC and then eventually Columbia Heights. DC has one of the largest Ethiopian populations, outside of Ethiopia. It has Vietnamese diaspora. We have a huge Salvadorian diaspora, particularly in Mount Pleasant where I grew up. And so that's kind of one part of it. Another is the elementary school I went to is called Elsie Whitlow Stokes, and it is a freedom school. And part of that was a very open and liberatory framework for what learning could look like in young people. A kind of very engaged parent-teacher interaction, and then also just a school from opening that was 97% not white. You know, we kind of started in a church that literally is a organizing space and has been for like 40 years and has like housed all these different movements, and we're in the basement of that for like second and third grade. It's like, that's another space. There's like the Latin American Youth Center that's around the corner. They used to have an art house. It was a lot of like being around people, doing things. All of these people and spaces all kind of interacted with one another. There was also a place it was originally called the Language Access Coalition. And those folk really pushed this DC law that required translation for all government documents into any language, right? So like part of it was that this work was happening next to me as I was growing up, while the communities themselves were advocating for these changes and were folks who I was kind of in the room with as these processes of facilitation and organizing were happening. And so that's part of it. And then also, I think, I was thinking about this yesterday, it was also that my mom was kind of interacting in dance a lot in community spaces. So a lot of these places already kind of knew my mom and like kind of opened themselves up in much more flexible ways than I might have had otherwise. For one place, they were really hardcore about like formal lessons. Like you have to go through all this curriculum in order to even touch the guitar, touch the instrument. At places where my mom taught, like they would just like be like, okay, Inti's here, go to the instrument room, go to the music room, entertain yourself for the couple hours that she's teaching. And then of course like Irishness and indigeneity are both like, my father is born and raised in Dublin, I was born in Dublin, my mom is Ecuadorian and Andean and indigenous, and so these are things that I grew up with, but always traveling in between, always learning, and generally not actually being around that many Irish or Indian people. And then also I haven't even mentioned the majority Black community in DC, which was like all the folks I was growing up with, and I'm still kind of in community with when I come back to DC.
Awesome. And so speaking of your background with a family of organizers, I'm curious how they responded to your interest in music, if it was seen as kind of frivolous or if it was a really sort of validated path that you took. Yeah, how the family reacted.
I always was convinced that I wasn't going to be an artist. I have artists in both sides of my family, and I mean, they were always super encouraging of all kind of artistic expression and all this stuff. And I think kind of when I was younger, I was really into science and math. And so when I actually went into music, they were really like, they were relieved a little bit. They were like, oh, you're not going to just, make a check and go home, which was, kind of what maybe I had a limited view of what life could be a little bit when I was younger. I was like, I just want to get a good job, then I can just hang out and that'll be my life. And then kind of turning into this, actually creativity and communication and facilitation are all these things that I like grew up and learned around and through and with. These things feel like they're really applicable to this particular, medium and practice of music making. I think that part of what I learned how to do in the spaces that I grew up in was listen really hard. In an active sense, in the sense of like descriptive listening, when when someone is saying something to you and you kind of say it back, or you change it, or you kind of bring it into a larger context, as this kind of engaged thing. And I think that first kind of activity has kind of grown into this entire practice. And they are very happy about it. And I think that they're happy that I was kind of able to take this knowledge that they kind of built around me and always kind of allowed me to participate in as an equal. Through that early on, I think it's kind of given me the sense that when I go into spaces with performers, there isn't a kind of disconnect that I was always told by composition teachers there was. And so maybe that was given early and it's kind of being fruitful now.
How do you think your music would be best experienced? Like if you could have your druthers and be like, it's a record player in a room with lots of pillows, or it's a large concert hall or whatever, what that kind of ideal scenario is. But then going along with that, because I know every piece has its differences, if there's a specific piece that you are very fond of or might consider a favorite, if you want to talk about the ideal listening experience for that particular piece.
I think maybe I have this little bit of a romantic notion of chamber music and of proximity. I like some of my earlier music making was in like DIY punk spaces. And so like, those were like tiny houses where you had like 10 people in a room, someone sitting on the floor or standing, and you like sitting like, this close to them because it was too packed. There were too many people. And I think that kind of proximity also affected how people played. I think that there was this kind of delicacy that you could do it. It wasn't just kind of maximum sound all the time. And that kind of the context of a performance often feels like it's this invisible thing that is affecting how all these processes are being interacted with in the sense that players are trying to make them most appropriate for the context that they're in, be it they're amplified, they're in a large concert hall, they're in a small concert hall, they're in front of you at a dinner table or something. Like it's another member a little bit of the ensemble that kind of is interacting with it. And so I think one of my ideal pieces, and maybe its context, would be, I have a percussion trio called To Give You Form and Breath, and it's all these like found objects. Part of it was this idea that the percussionists were constructing their own instruments, and that felt really kind of beautiful to me, especially with like found junk materials. And so part of it is that like I've noticed that in performances of that piece, like people like, especially in like concert situations, are like banging these things as like hard as they can. And I'm like, oh, okay, like that's what you need to do to get the kind of sound that you want out of them. But I would love to be close. Like I would love to have that piece performed in a really small space and like hear how that sounds, or hear it performed a little spatialized or something, or like in a small space, but it isn't just kind of this front to back performer audience kind of thing. Because like I feel like the materials themselves have more to say than just the hardest you construct them.
That was an excerpt of Inti Figgis-vizueta's To Give You Form and Breath, performed by Redfish Bluefish, the percussion group out of UC San Diego run by Steve Schick. You have spoken about being in a process of learning to negotiate how you set value for sharing your time and perspective, particularly when educating white and cishet peers. So yeah, where are you on that journey at this point?
Yeah, I mean, I think that part of it is that I've tried to construct music to interact with that a little bit, where like I think of the way in which I ask people to engage with perception, understanding, listening, reaction, interaction, all this stuff as itself a kind of practice of what listening is and of what inferring understanding is, which I think is something that we as BIPOC people, that's something we learn really early, is how to read that in other people. And like the thing that I experience most in these spaces and continue to experience and all this stuff is that lack of reading past the immediate. And that being kind of in interaction a little bit for me just personally with trusting people and what they say, which is this like really kind of contentious thing to feel like we're like, I really want to trust people, and I've really pushed myself in that direction of like, when people say something, they deserve to be trusted in what they're saying until they show that it's not true, and without the expectation that someone will show it to be not true. So that being one space, and then the other one being this, I think in some ways I've stopped correcting people, like when it comes to pronouns and things in spaces, like I don't have the energy to and I guess I mean stop correcting people towards myself. When it comes to students and when it comes to friends and mentees and stuff who I need to advocate for, there's no question that like that's like where we're at. Like I will not like let someone like hurt my peeps and my flowers and, you know, like the folks who I'm trying to bolster. But I think just like personally, like I just don't have the energy anymore to like be like, your stance on this is philosophically, ideologically, and ontologically wrong. Like, you know, I've had to discuss with like the professor, you know, of these spaces why this thing is racist or something, or why this thing is anti-Indigenous, or why this thing is anti-Black. Having them like come back at me with this kind of language and maybe like, okay, so like, do I need to like, you know, get this like veneer of academic vocabulary in order for you to understand me? Maybe, and maybe that's, maybe I've pursued a little bit of that vocabulary so that I can speak that way. But on the other end of like, you just obviously are not seeing people in the way that they are presenting themselves. And that itself is like a problem. Like if, you know, in the sense that sometimes like cis people will, you can see and tell when they are seeing you in the initial way that they see you and then pasting something over it every time they speak, right? Versus like truly interacting with you in the way in which you are. And that's something that I just don't have time for anymore. Like if that is happening, then I just leave the space because I'm really like, I'm kind of really busy and I have like a lot to do. And just like the idea that every single person has to be called out for every single moment is just like exhausting. But I think like there are these like I really try and look out for like the moments in which like I can see like someone truly just doesn't understand this thing and are like kind of flailing a little bit and differentiating that from like harm. Right? Like the flailing might like, you know, like maybe you get slapped a little bit and it like stings, but like you can still kind of parse that this person's like good and is like really trying. I think it's just being a little bit more strategic with battles is maybe the like really TLDR of it. Is like, I think the other thing is just the way in which I think by entering spaces and having the kind of visibility that I have, other people join me often. Other people who wouldn't be in those spaces otherwise. So like, for example, in spaces that I go to teach, often I have more trans composers applying and entering the space than I've seen before. I also have more people of color. And it's like, well, in that sense, then I have more responsibility towards those people when they're entering the space to be an advocate and to be an ally and to be someone who is active in that relationship. And that to me is where I want to have the work happen. Like I want to put the energy into my communities. And like I think when that happens, I feel like then like that energy can like multiply over time, right? That the initial like, and you know, for example, something like Wildflower Composers, which used to be Young Women Composers Camp, I have seen folks who like it is their first time composing. The fact that like I get to talk to people the first time they're composing, nurture them through that process, and then see them have their piece played by other non-men is just like this incredible experience. I'm just like, oh my God, I wish I had that. But B, like, you know, when I feel like when that happens, you know, you're creating like the first rotation of something that can turn into a lot more energy than like someone who's already kind of chugging along and you have to like press brake on their thing with your bare hands, and then like you're kind of, you know, like a little rubbed raw or something. It just, yeah.
Yeah, for sure. And you do a ton of work with up-and-coming composers. I know whether the mentoring with Luna Lab and Wildflower Composers, and then this year you joined Fifth House Ensemble's Fresh Ink Festival as lead composition faculty. I'm just wondering if there's anything you've observed about this new generation of composers that you find either particularly concerning or promising. And then continuing that train of thought, is there any advice you hear yourself giving, like all the time?
Yeah. Okay. So yeah, part of this has been that pedagogy is something that touched me really hard. Like it touched me when I was trying to learn this initially. And I think being kind of late to it, I kind of felt it, like it felt very heavy in the way in which kind of idealization of combined words, idolization as well as idealization of older generations of composers, of kind of really specific streams of aesthetic, of what expressivity feels like or sounds like or is like. And so I when I see that pedagogy in my students, I really try and address it. And that's part of like why I pursue that work, is that I feel like I feel like I wish someone had told me what I could tell people, which is that you can do this and you can make beautiful music with amazing people and, do it well, while still pursuing your own way of doing it. Like to me, there's unevenness sometimes in the way in which we ask people to use their bodies as composers. And so I think part of it is trying to make sure that there's a level of evenness and democratization and creativity that players can also put into their music. And I just remember as a student, I was discouraged from doing that so hard. I was like, they were like, it takes too much time. You'll never get a good performance. Do you really want to waste this opportunity doing this thing? Like, these people are so important. Like, do you really want to like burden them with like asking them to like, read a sentence or something? In the sense of like maybe an instruction of how to interact instead of the writing it out prescriptively. And so I think like seeing that, and then also, I want to say this delicately, there are certain older generations that are still the ones who are points of first contact for young composers that I teach. And part of it is that I recognize that pedagogy when I see it sometimes, and I'm like, okay, we're going to have to talk about this. So like that's the concerning part. The promising part for me has been just how technology has helped people think about sound. In particular, like I found like a lot of my students love TikTok. I've had students who are really kind of creative in the way in which it inspires them to make music. The idea of field recording and video recording, collage, creating your own kinds of visual media to create music to, all feels like stuff that's just super generative and gets us outside of some of the pitfalls of kind of a traditional pedagogy towards classical composition. So that's that one. And then the last question was...
If there's advice that you find yourself giving over and over.
Advice I find myself giving. Yeah, I mean... one thing that comes up for me is just this idea that composing equals writing music for everyone. And that being kind of both in the sense of like writing towards an everyone audience, as well as the idea that when you're kind of creating notation, you're trying to make it as immediately decipherable for anyone in the world. But the moment that you do that, you basically place yourself within the context of notation that's already happened, right? And approaches that have already been done. And so it's like this kind of like this, this limiting factor that or this kind of filter that we're taught to give ourselves. And that filter, I think, is called quality or called efficiency or called correctness or rightness. And that's something that needs to be critically engaged and needs to be like shaken a little bit. Maybe you break the thing and you can tape it back together. And maybe you'll feel bad once you break it and you tape it back together, but like maybe you'll see something. Hopefully you see something that you wouldn't have seen before. When that is such a part of how I have found being able to do it, I guess, like for a long time, and being able to like work with the people who I only dreamed about like 10 years ago or whatever, is a sense that came from pursuing my own way of speaking and pursuing my own way of communicating and thinking about how sound and creativity can be organized in time. And that if I'm not teaching others to also pursue that, then I don't really know what I'm doing, right? Like, it's like, because it's not like I'm not going there to be like, yes, you really need to double your flute and clarinet at the octave to really like get this texture that you want. Because like, of course that's like helpful advice. Maybe I say it sometimes, but like, I think a bigger part of it is like, how are you thinking of the clarinet? What about the physical nature of the clarinet, the way in which it engages overtones, its construction itself? How can you let that affect the way in which you think about it instead of just a pitch machine or just like a color that you can throw into space? Because there's also a human attached to the thing that you're asking, and someone who themselves are this like encyclopedia of music that they've played. And I think that like when you start to ask people to engage with their personhood in their music, you get something so much more special than, not more special, like it's not a competition, but like, that you can touch something that otherwise, if you don't know you aren't touching it, you won't touch it. or it'll be accidental again.
It seems to me like you have a pretty optimistic view of people. And I'm wondering if that's accurate, and I'm wondering how much that has to do with your upbringing. And because I could also imagine becoming really sour on people for exactly the same reasons. So yeah, just curious how your outlook.
I've met enough people who I genuinely think believe in the things that we do and believe in me and believe in each other and in the kind of optimistic, idealistic way that I want to be. So if I surround myself with other people who believe that and want to be that as much as me, then it can be. And so that's part of it. And I think that also interacts a little bit with this kind of institution thing and this community thing, is that I have found that it isn't a value that is imparted by institutions. You know, it's one that people either have to bring or they have to cultivate it or whatever. And I guess I also found out that I can't not say anything when I interact, you know, when I see things and when I hear things and when I do. And maybe that also is this kind of this throwback to again speaking truth to power, or like trying to actually get to truth in every moment or something. And, you know, not truth being this like thing that we can achieve, but it being this kind of dialogic and building thing that you kind of build over time.
Inti figgis-vizueta is acutely aware of both the power and responsibility she has to create her world with every interaction. And it was my pleasure to learn a little bit more about her point of view. Many thanks to Inti for making time to speak with us, and thank you so much for listening to the Here Together podcast from the Philadelphia Orchestra. If you enjoyed this episode, please be sure to like, subscribe, rate, review, comment, and share with your friends. I'm Tori Marchiony, and we'll be back next month with more stories about music, social justice, and all the life in between. As we exit, I hope you'll enjoy a bit more of Imago, composed by Inti figgis-vizueta and performed by Attacca Quartet. Till next time.